Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast-forward planet, which remains wrapped in a pandemic with still significant gaps of vaccine inequity. And this virus will keep permutating and taking advantage of issues like that going forward. It's an overheating planet, human heated, with very turbulent outcomes. It's a planet now wrapped in energy insecurity because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And we're in the middle of a misinformation storm that seems tough to navigate sometimes. I'm Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School, and my job is to help guide, to the extent possible, through these complexities toward progress, toward a more sustainable planet, a cooler relationship with each other and with the planet too. There's a release today of a new valuable report on humanitarian response to extreme heat in a changing climate, in a human heated climate. The findings are very important. They're valuable well beyond the arena of humanitarian response, but it's good to dig in on this because, as anyone who experienced the extreme heat this year so far in the Northern Hemisphere summer, you understand what the potentials are for adverse outcomes. And it's not an even map. If you're wealthier, if you have an air conditioner to turn on, the outcomes are very different than if you're a farm worker or an urban worker in a baking city, or if you're a refugee in a camp with very little, few assets. That's also beset by other kinds of stresses. I'm glad to have the lead author, Greg Puley from the UN. You'll remind me what OCHA means in a second. I was referring to OCHA recently in the context of food aid to the Horn of Africa from Ukraine. And Achala Navaratne, who's at the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. Achala is a senior advisor to at IFRC, and on this kind of project, he's a leading expert on climate disasters in Bangladesh and South Asia, based in Dhaka. And Greg has worked for a very long time. Actually, on this report, he took a sabbatical from his regular work to dig in on this issue of heat stress and building more resilience going forward. So it's great to have you both here. Maybe we'll start with Greg. This took a number of months to put together. If you could just get at the why question first, why was this needed? What's the urgency? And then we'll hear from Achala on a couple of other aspects and go forward.
Okay, thanks very much, Andy. And to answer your first question, OCHA is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs.
Bingo. There you go.
So that's a mouthful, but it's the part of the UN Secretariat that coordinates the response to humanitarian emergencies, conflict, and disasters.
It's a very busy place.
It's very busy, busier than ever, unfortunately. Yeah. And what we're trying to do is create a situation where we're not going to be many times busier than we already are because of extreme heat waves in the future. Unfortunately, we are on track now to have much more frequent and much more severe extreme heat events because of climate change. Extreme heat already is a major driver of death and suffering in many different parts of the world. And the climate science is telling us extremely clearly that what we can expect is a future of more frequent and more severe heat waves if we don't take very aggressive steps now to mitigate climate change and to adapt. But the why for this report is that even if we're very successful in those steps, we're not particularly on track to be successful in those steps now. We know that we will be seeing more frequent humanitarian impacts of extreme heat, and we need to have a system that's prepared to support people through that trauma.
For sure. And just to remind folks, if there's one aspect of the climate, the array of climate changes that are associated with rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, heat is the most profoundly, confidently understood fact. Since 1988, when I was writing about this the first time, that really is front and center. If you can argue for a long time actually about hurricanes, they're complicated. There are a lot of things going on with the hurricane, but heat waves, duration and intensity is exactly the kind of fingerprint you expect. So Achala, take us to that region of the world, South Asia, and tell us how important this is, and again, and why, and then we'll get into some of the findings.
Sure, Andy. I think what you highlighted before is a critically important fact. You mentioned with the changing climate, heat is what is straightforward to see, and it's quite visible. But unfortunately, when you are a frog in a kind of pot that is heating, you kind of don't realize actually it is heating, and you pay attention to so many other things, and you don't realize the exact what is extreme heat and where are you on this. So why I want to come at it from a humanitarian perspective. You mentioned hurricanes and other aspects. We as humanitarians, we prepare for the cyclones and the hurricanes and the typhoons much more because it's quite visible, it's big, and it does have large scale impacts, which are visible, and the media pays attention to it. Same with large scale floods. Obviously, they are also connected to the changing climate. They are becoming more and more extreme and causing more damage. But if you start looking at it from the practical perspective of how we see this in a disaster environment, we pay so much attention to those types of disasters than the heat aspect that this document highlights, because extreme heat actually is not seen as sometimes a disaster in some of the countries, and right. That then automatically, when you don't see it as a problem, then trying to address it becomes an issue as humanitarian. So that is why this call for action by the UN and the IFRC is so important, because sometimes we do not see this as an issue collectively as a society to address it, because when it comes to hurricanes, cyclones, we have early warning systems, we have anticipate reaction, early action, we have response mechanisms. But when it comes to extreme heat, sometimes we don't connect those dots. We don't see it in the same way. So that's why it is really important for the humanitarians, not only for the humanitarians, but the governments, and to have a whole of society approach to address this in the same way that we are looking at the other disasters. And as climate changes and as extreme heat becomes, unfortunately, a frequent event, we have no option but to consider it similar to the other large-scale disasters that we are looking at. So that's why this is so important. And that's why we thank Greg and the team for doing this, because we need to sound the alarm.
Yeah, this graphic is actually useful from the report. I think it was from the Lancet study as well, which shows there's also enormous death tolls in developed countries, so-called developed countries. Those big balls at the top of the chart were Russia and France. And one thing that I've been trying to stress in my writing is that the vulnerabilities that face the poor or the dislocated or those who've been marginalized through prejudice or poverty, that can be right down the block from you in a very prosperous city, whether it's Singapore or Portland, Oregon, where again that was found in the deaths. The deaths are people who are homeless, or so it's a vulnerability divide that really does drive this. So maybe we'll get to the core findings. Greg, take us, and then we'll get to some of these themes that come up. Greg, when you think about the core takeaways, where do you start?
Well, I mean, the key finding I touched on earlier, which is that the extreme heat events of this past summer and what we've seen in many different parts of the world, both high-income contexts and low-income contexts, foreshadow a world of far more frequent and far more severe extreme heat events. As you say, the impact of these heat waves is fundamentally unequal. Thermal inequality is the phrase that we use in the report to describe this phenomenon. It's both a geographic phenomenon and low-income countries are already experiencing outsized increases in extreme heat, and between 1.5 and 2 degrees of mean warming, which we're currently, unfortunately, on track to exceed. The biggest increases in extreme heat are projected in lower income contexts. So there's a geographical imbalance, injustice in the impacts of this phenomenon, which impacts those primarily who are least responsible for greenhouse gas emissions.
Right.
But then within societies, there's the thermal inequality of a socioeconomic status, as you point out. If you overlay the extreme deaths in a heat wave over mapping of socioeconomic status, you see a very close correlation, not only because of the heightened vulnerability of people who have livelihoods that they can't adapt or fewer access to basic services. Essentially, the most vulnerable people are pushed to the front lines in a heat wave because they do not have the resources to protect themselves, or they do not have the choices available to them to protect themselves. But also because poorer neighborhoods are hotter.
Right.
And so there's a much higher exposure, both indoors because of building materials and population density, and outdoors because of urban planning and the lack of treed space, shade, etc. So there's a marked difference in the impact of a heat wave between poorer neighborhoods and wealthier neighborhoods, and that's a big contributor to thermal inequality as well.
That's such an interesting concept, a way of framing it. I really think it's valuable. I'm going to throw on the screen very quickly just a little thumbnail sketch of some recent research on this. I'll show it in a minute. There's a researcher at Carnegie Mellon University, Destiny Knock, who's from Africa originally, and she found that this is in Philadelphia, I believe, poor households, as a heat wave is building, they wait another 4 to 7 degrees until they turn on their air conditioners. So they're poor, like lower middle class people who have an air conditioner, and it's all about money. They're trying to save money. So it's like, that's just a perfect little lens on that thermal inequality concept you just talked about. Really interesting. And then, so take us to the humanitarian specific suggestions. So these are the basic phenomena, the basic changes that are underway. How does that relate to planning and response for, as Achala was saying, we were pretty good at these sudden events. Well, Bangladesh has gotten really good at prevention and mitigation of risk, particularly for flooding and the like, because of your experience with cyclones. But heat is harder. So what would you do, Achala and then Greg, to ease the burden, to spread resilience in these communities who are already, in that mode that they need humanitarian aid?
Yes, Greg, I think, and sorry, Andy, I think the points you both raised, there is the most important aspect is when you look at countries like Bangladesh, why it has been so successful in avoiding major disasters, is because the public is aware, and there is a whole of society approach with policy. Some of the issues that Greg highlighted on whether it's urban planning and all of those things are necessary, because you need the authorities, the governments, the cities, and all of those people to work on the heat aspect. Now, when it comes to, let's say, cyclones, I would say there is a very clear common ground that is made by everybody, starting from the awareness side, with whether it's at the local level, the communities are very much aware of what's happening, the media is aware, there is whoever the responders are very much aware. So the question when it comes to heat is also, how do we do that part? Now, what are the missing gaps? So when it comes to awareness, that extreme heat is a risk. Extreme heat actually causes death, and also not only that, a lot of health issues. Those are aspects that we really need to work on as we go on as humanitarians. Secondarily, we need to work on the early warning aspects, because we have a lot to do on what is a heat wave and when does it become something that we really need to take seriously. So the science aspects, because right now, whether it's cyclones, whether it's floods, we are working with the meteorological departments of each of the countries, trying to see how best to improve those, so that we have a number of days of early warning, which comes a little bit earlier, so we can anticipate reaction or be ready. Now in heat, how can we do those things? So those are the aspects we are trying to figure out and to do better. Some cities in Asia are doing it well. Some countries are doing it well, where they have policy, where they have the national disaster management authorities identify when to call it as an emergency. So calling it an emergency is a critical aspect to trigger action at a societal level, right? The media has to take it seriously. So I think there is a lot for us to do in the extreme heat context, where we need to create that awareness at a broad level and to bring policy changes that need to happen, and specifically focusing on those most vulnerable people, right? Because in a cyclone belt, we would have cyclone shelters to shelter the most vulnerable. But in a heat environment, what do we do? So how do we respond to the most vulnerable? So those are the pieces which we need to work on as the humanitarians. And of course, we can do quick things which are like immediate responses. But it's also not just the quick emergency responses that we need to do. It's also the long-term planning that needs to happen, because when you're talking about urban planning or creating public spaces or open spaces, it's much higher than just what humanitarians can do. So yes, humanitarians can do a little bit, but it's a lot of investment on infrastructure and other support mechanisms that need to happen. Same as investment needs to go on mitigating climate change and adapting to it, we need to work on these heat aspects in the same way, and targeting heat as a critical aspect that's going to be very much an issue, especially in the urban settings more than the rural settings. Because the urban settings, as Greg highlighted, more people live there, higher risk, and most of the time, the most vulnerable are even more hidden. We don't see them. So how do we really target them? How do we find them? How do we support them? So that's what we are trying to deal with in the context of whether it's Bangladesh or India and some of these, high population density areas.
So you've laid out a real systems issue and approach. The best way to limit overload for humanitarian response is to limit people who are pushed into a state of disaster. The warnings and the capacity to understand where the vulnerable people are. And I think the elderly are particularly high on the list, obviously the homeless. So Greg, again, thinking about that, the sort of humanitarian action plan part of this, building on what Achala was just saying, what comes to mind?
Well, the first thing is to say that it is possible to significantly reduce mortality in a heat wave. You showed the chart earlier, particularly, the very high mortality heat wave in France and other parts of Europe in 2003. They have actually had much more severe heat waves since then, with much lower mortality.
Right.
So heat action plans that bring together a whole of government and a whole of society, including civil society, local organizations, a comprehensive approach can significantly limit mortality and morbidity in a heat wave, and not just in a high-income context like France. We've also seen significant reductions in Ahmedabad in India, for example. 100 cities in India have these extreme heat action plans. So it is about learning from what works and applying it in different contexts. Of course, we need to bear in mind that success is based on the climate that we're in today. And you can't necessarily project that into the future, because as we've touched on, climate change is going to bring new and previously unimaginable levels of extreme heat. That's why it's so important to emphasize the longer term challenges of mitigating and adapting to climate change. But yes, within the emergency response sphere, there is some success to build upon. And I think the most important point to make in that regard is that that's local action. We do not envision, in the way that we rush international assistance to the scene of the disaster for these massive floods in Pakistan, for the drought in the Horn of Africa, for the conflict in Ukraine, we cannot conceive of an international humanitarian system that rushes international assistance to the scene of the disaster for heat waves in the future. We need emergency responses that are embedded in local communities, not least because, as Achala said, the vulnerability profile, who's really the most at risk because of their age, because of their health status, if it's pregnant and breastfeeding women, because of their socioeconomic status, that requires detailed local knowledge and expertise. And that is held in local actors. So what we need is an international system that is geared at supporting and enabling that kind of local response, rather than a global system where international aid workers ride to the rescue.
Yeah, that sort of distributed capacities, that lesson comes out over and over again. The UNDRR, the Disaster Risk Reduction Group, I've been involved with them on some things. It helps that they have 8 regional hubs, 8 sort of geographic hubs, and each one of those, ideally, as you say, should have 800 local hubs. Having that, making sure resources get to those regions is key. In the United States, it's a challenge because local governments, we saw this even in Florida with evacuation plans. It was Lee County chose to wait an extra day and has higher mortality as a Sorry, this section is the satellite slowed down. So hold on, let's get back into give it a second. It's so funny. Let me pull up a slide too. Yeah, that was one of those gaps I was talking about. I'm scrolling through the report to get to something else to show. So give me a second. Where is it here? Hold on. Oops. Here we go. So it's clear that even though global warming is global, responses to the stresses it's creating are all local. No one lives at the average, well, not very many people live in the average climate of the planet, roughly 60-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. San Diego, I think, is pretty close to like that sweet spot. So when you think about that, just you were just describing some of the importance of getting the local capacity, but what are the things that can be done? You described how do you become situationally aware of where the elderly people are, the poor people? How much what's the role of social media, for example, or community groups? Do you harness religious groups, or who are the other actors that need to be pulled in to take us from this general map of risk and opportunity to the specific kinds of successes? Maybe we'll start in Dhaka too, in Bangladesh. Achala.
Thanks, Andy. There's a reason why in this also we are working together with UNOCHA and IFRC, because IFRC, when you talked about the different numbers of local organizations that need to be there. IFRC is the umbrella organization of 192 national Red Cross, Red Crescent societies across each of the countries. So in each of the countries, we have a local national Red Cross or Red Crescent that is doing this work. And our work is community-based. So we are doing community-based disaster risk reduction work in all the countries that we are working in one way or the other. That is why, if you take the cyclone preparedness program, that is a joint effort with the government of Bangladesh that the Bangladesh Red Crescent is doing. So we are in the communities, we are looking at what we call community disaster preparedness plans and readiness plans and all of these things. But sometimes what happens is when we say a disaster preparedness plan, we may not look at heat as one of the extreme heat as one of the disasters that could happen. And that's what we are trying to incorporate now into our system, because the tradition of what was considered a disaster is changing, right? So that is when we talk about climate change, that is what we are sitting with our communities and saying, this is the change that is happening. What you thought was just a little bit of heat is not a little bit of heat anymore. It's extreme heat, and this is how it's going to impact. So when we are working with the informal neighborhoods, whether we talk about the slums, when we were previously looking at maybe flooding as an issue, now we are not only looking at that, but we are also incorporating that into, as Greg said, some sort of a heat action plan for that community. What do you do in this moment? Who are the people you need to protect? What are the things you can do to make sure in your environment to reduce the impact? So it could be various things that communities identify that is available there. Again, just as we are saying it's local, it also needs to be community-based. So even if it is in Bangladesh, local needs to be the community deciding what's happening and informing them and engaging them to take their own measures, understanding what that risk is, right? So that is the work that we do. But when I say that's what we are doing, that also needs to be fully informed of the information that comes as not just like a cyclone or a flood. When does heat become a risk? So that is where we need to bridge that gap between our volunteers understanding what it means, when this needs to be taken seriously, and then obviously working with the different groups of alerting when a heat wave is there. So as Greg highlighted, if there's a citywide heat action plan, then there will be some sort of alert that comes, and then based on that, the communities can take the necessary action. But those things have to be connected. There needs to be some connection between, because communities will not know when to take action if the alert mechanism is not there. So then it needs to connect to a bigger picture. So that's the piece where, when it comes to local engagement, that is what we are doing right now in some of the cities, especially in Bangladesh and other places, where we are targeting and saying, okay, communities, this is how we can work. City, this is what we can do, and this is what the media can do, and this is what social media can do in this case for a heat alert. But again, as organizations, we can do only so much unless the government or the city makes that heat alert to the rest of the people. So that's where we also need to work on the science side, and also on the connecting the alert stuff, because we can't just wait for the government to do it. That's where the UN, the Red Cross, and the other partners can work together, including with the private sector. In some cases, we work with partners like Google, we work with partners like Facebook. So it has to be, again, a whole of society approach where we are using the private sector also in these engagements. It's not just the humanitarians' work to do this.
Sure. And, the media, you mentioned the big platforms, the media, weather forecasters, radio, all those means are super important. But as you were saying, even that landscape is different country to country. In the United States, in South Asia, whether it's SMS, WhatsApp. WhatsApp is a much more active platform overseas than it is here in the United States, for example. So Greg, to your view too, then let's just talk about the media, or how big a chunk of this is the communication component, which is my arena.
Well, it's a very big chunk. When there is an early warning, one challenge is putting the early warning systems in place so that policymakers are aware, constantly monitoring, aware, and have internal networks to have a whole of government or whole of society approach when an early warning is issued. So that's one challenge. But then, as you're saying, and this is relevant to the media, the second challenge is actually communicating that out to people who will be impacted so that they can change their behaviors. They understand the risks of what's coming, and they know what support is available to them. So obviously, in each society, the mix of communication means will be different, as you pointed out, vis-a-vis different social media platforms in different parts of the world. But social media is only one part of it. We've seen extreme heat action plans that count on the radio, that count on community events, that use broadcast television, and through religious organizations as well. You mentioned the importance of religious organizations. There are a number of examples of religious organizations being critical in, for example, providing cooling centers in a mosque or a church or a temple, but also in reaching out to people in their communities, particularly the elderly, the isolated, the vulnerable, who might not have access to the information about the coming heat wave, but who are the ones where the information is the most critical because they're at the highest risk. And religious communities very often have knowledge of that detailed knowledge of the community and those networks. So yes, the modern media and means of communicating are important, but so too are traditional means of communicating and engaging with people.
I froze there briefly, but I think which is really important about the people who are most in need or most vulnerable are often the ones who are off the grid. Essentially, they're not on WhatsApp or the like.
Precisely,
and that's where face-to-face organizations are key. That was one of the huge revelations of the work of Eric Kleinenberg in Chicago, the Great Chicago Heat Wave in the 90s, which was that communities that had social cohesion. This is before the internet, before where they knew, that grandma living on the 10th floor of that building, we need to look after her. That's where you had lower mortality. So sometimes it's very basic steps that can lead to better outcomes. Sorry.
If I can add, Andy, on that, we used to normally call the last mile mobile solutions last mile solutions. We say last mile is not enough. It's the last meter, because it has to be a lot of the time face to face, because there's sometimes when media is also there, as Greg was highlighting, people trust the traditional ways of communication way more than sometimes any other forms of communication. So it is important, that community aspect. It is important that the volunteers or whoever the organizations that are available are tapped into, because it's the last meter that really counts for sometimes people taking early action. Because we do a lot of talk about early warning. People get an early warning, but sometimes they don't really take the action unless they really trust it and they kind of see who is giving it to them. So for us, it is not just the early warning that is important. It is the early action that people are taking individually or as a community. And that also depends very much on the trust that people have. So the points that Greg made about the organizers that have the trust of the community, the individuals who have the trust of the community who is carrying that early warning, is critical.
That's great. Yeah, and this I think the lessons here apply well beyond the audience this report is primarily intended for. I think so. Hopefully, it'll get outside. I'll do what I can to make sure these lessons and insights are spread as much as possible. It reminds me of a conversation I've been planning to have with folks at Twitter and in Jakarta who've developed an app using Twitter that's a sort of flash flood monitoring, situational awareness around that giant city. But the key thing here, as you say, is this is more of a creeping problem. It's like a slow disaster. And even in the United States, I think if you look at the quote unquote $1 billion disaster list that NOAA puts out, heat is not still on there. It's not normalized yet to be something we think about that way. We don't name heat storms the way we name heat wave. We name hurricanes. And I hope this report can help to have folks look at these general trends, find their specific lens on it or action point, and go forward. Anyone who's an educator, this can play really wonderfully in classrooms as something any teacher in a region that's vulnerable can start to work with kids on. I think so. Hopefully, this can play a role in lesson plans can be built around it as well, that kind of thing. So Greg, any last hopes for who should read it or how it might play out into action?
Well, I certainly hope that the negotiators at the COP read it, so they can be fully seized of the stakes for people of aggressive steps to mitigate climate change. I hope that international financial institutions and donors and other financiers of climate adaptation read it, so that they can understand that there's no humanitarian solution to this. What we need are long-term investments in climate adaptation, in addition to doing everything possible to slowing and stopping global warming. And of course, we hope that humanitarian actors, those involved in emergency response, can read it so that they can, as Achala say, adapt the tools that we have, build the new partnerships that we need, and begin to establish a system to protect people to the extent we possibly can for what's coming vis-a-vis extreme heat and humidity.
You made so many valuable points. Let's go over one more thought. And this is this. I created this graphic recently, and thinking, to my mind, the global climate treaty, climate action community has not adequately absorbed the vulnerability divide. Even as you were saying, even adaptation is not the right way to think about this. It's really, if you want to reduce risk, meaning climate risk, if you're not focusing on that big bubble of vulnerability, and you can slow climate change and still have huge adverse outcomes. So that, I hope that personally, I feel that signal, the idea that the vulnerability divide gives so much actionable space to work on now, along with the long tough fight to cut emissions and slow global warming. It can actually overcome some of the sense of paralysis people feel. You know, to me, the climate emergency is a big chunk of it is a vulnerability emergency that many people don't seem to really talk about. It's fine to go out into the streets with your climate emergency sign, but look around your neighborhood, look around your country, your community, or talk to your local radio station about what they could do better. Feels like we can go a long way toward limiting the worst case outcomes. I don't know if that resonates too. Maybe Achala, I don't know what you think about that. Does it feel like that's underappreciated?
Well, I think these are some of the key topics that are going to be discussed at the COP27 as well, right? Like, I think when we are talking about increasing vulnerability that is coming due to additional, loss and damage and the, spiral that's going down, it is becoming a concern. And that's why, as Greg highlighted, the funding mechanisms should not only focus on the mitigation of the climate change aspects, but also addressing some of the underlying vulnerabilities that are there, poverty aspects. A lot of the time, very often funding, unfortunately, you started this highlighting the challenges we are having in the broad humanitarian setting. The funding is reducing, the funding availability is reducing. So how can we really support that who are the most vulnerable, not only from a disaster perspective, but in general, poverty reduction perspectives and all of those, because they are all connected. It is connected. But coming back to what Greg highlighted, I think the key message is there needs to be investment. Humanitarians can't be putting band-aids. We are already overflowing with so many emergencies that are happening. There needs to be so much investment that is happening, that is being made to stop where possible these impacts, but also a lot on the adaptation. There is not enough money still put on the agenda for adaptation, or even to reduce the vulnerability. So yes, the call is to have more support. Call is to have the voice of these vulnerable people are heard, and I hope this report that Greg has and the teams have prepared is a big call for that, and is seen by people as a call because this is time is ticking. We don't want to be the frog in hot water who don't realize that it is time is running out. So it's a tough, difficult situation.
Well, that's a fine place to end this discussion, which is obviously just the beginning. I've done several sessions here on extreme heat, and another voice that resonates always for me is Christy Ebi at University of Washington, who was an IPCC author on heat, who's one of the world's experts on heat and health, and who repeats this phrase all the time: nobody needs to die in a heat wave. It takes time to die in a heat wave, and that gives us time to have adequate responses. If you know who's vulnerable, if you know what to do, if they have a place to go or a solution. And of course, lowering the odds of heat waves is the goal, is the function and responsibility of everyone to work on the energy transition to stop heating the planet. Thank you both for being here today. Greg Puley, UNOCHA, UNOCHA, and Achala, small print
IFRC.
on my screen. Achala Navaratne at IFRC in Dhaka in Bangladesh. Be safe wherever you are. And once you've seen this, everybody, please share this with folks all around your community at every level, from congressman to your mayor to down the street. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School. This is Sustain What. You can follow me, get in touch with me through that scrolling bar at the bottom. Thank you.
Thank you.
So that was really good. I'll chop out some of those parts that were not optimal, and it'll post, that morning.
Great.